Oh, Jesus!
My father's killer, so we meet again.
Admit it. We are the same.
Battle 1.
The big giant sword, or the colossal sword, is a common trope in both video games and anime. They're characterized by being ridiculously oversized, generally as large or even larger than the person wielding it. The most famous of these swords is probably Cloud's Buster Sword from Final Fantasy VII, and, before that, Guts' Dragon Slayer from the Berserk manga. Nowadays, these swords come in so many ridiculous shapes and sizes that it's almost impossible to categorize them other than just saying they're really big freaking swords. Many of them do take the shape similar to the Dragon Slayer or the Buster Sword. Some of them are like oversized long swords or katanas. Some of them are just too strange to fit into a category. And while these swords do find themselves in pretty much every genre, especially from Japanese media, they do tend to be a staple of the fantasy genre, in worlds that are based off of medieval or Renaissance Europe. And like many others, I think it's fun to imagine how practical they would be in the real world. And I think it's a good excuse to talk about history to people who might not otherwise be interested in it. So extremely large swords actually did exist. This is a montante or greatsword, or whatever the heck you want to call it, that I covered in a different video. It's not a training sword, it's completely sharp, and it weighs over 7 pounds. This is generally accepted as one of the biggest swords that was ever used in combat in European history. But swords weren't made this long just for the heck of it. They're not just stylistic preferences. Every single feature on this sword has an intended purpose. And while these two-handed crucifix-formed swords are iconic imagery of the Renaissance and medieval era, in the scope of human history, two-handed swords actually didn't exist for a very long period of time. For the most part of human history, swords were one-handed secondary weapons that worked in synchronization with shields. These swords had short handles to maximize control, and smaller crossguards for maneuverability. Defense was primarily handled by the shield, and the sword had to be able to work behind the shield without catching anything, while also being long enough to hit the enemy behind their shield. And as armor evolved, the sword evolved in lockstep. As the fully armored man-at-arms became even more impervious to harm, now you didn't need a shield to fight. So the swords got bigger and allowed for use with two hands. It now became the sword's job to defeat armor. The sword could be reversed and used like a poleaxe, or by half-swording, you could wrestle your way in close and find the gaps in armor, or to bash your opponent. The pommel could be spiked, the crossguard could be sharpened. Around the 16th century, the sword needed to adapt again. This larger greatsword was now a primary military weapon. On the battlefield, soldiers wielding these massive swords fought within pike blocks, or military units made up primarily of soldiers with pikes, which were 20-foot spears. They were said to fight on the front lines, chopping the heads off of enemy pikes, or by creating openings. And it can easily catch spears or other polearms that are incoming and allow you to displace them so you can close the distance. The quillons on the blade also have that effect, and they can also protect your hands if you decide to use the sword like a spear. And there's a nice unsharpened area on the strong of the blade so that you can do that. In civilian settings, these swords were used to fight multiple attackers at the same time, ranging from about 5 to 6 feet long. This sword was considered to be the largest functional sword to ever be used in European military history. But they actually weren't the largest swords that we know of that were used during the Renaissance in Europe. The largest swords were actually around 7 to even 8 feet long. The modern term or classification for these swords is bearing sword. Essentially, they were thought to be ceremonial swords only, thought to be carried by squires or bodyguards during large parades, to supposedly demonstrate the wealth and power of its owner. And while there is some evidence for this, it's still just conjecture. We actually don't know for a fact that every sword of this size was used for that purpose. Wikipedia currently uses this image on their article about bearing swords. It's taken from a book called A Treatise on Ancient Armor and Weapons, which was written in 1786. This massive sword here is accompanied by this suit of armor. The actual book makes no mention of this being a bearing sword. The writer of this book only mentions that this sword could have only been used by an extremely strong person. Oh, and that armor still exists to this day. You can see it at the Tower of London. It's called the Giant Armor, and it stands at almost 7 feet tall. A little bit smaller than the sword standing next to him. One of these swords is said to belong to a legendary Frisian warrior named Groote Pierre, or Big Pierre, who was known for his legendary size and strength. Now, these swords were made way before this guy was born, and the swords were attributed to him without any evidence. These swords were sharp. If they were blunted, it'd be an easy write-off. And you wouldn't be able to attribute them to a famous warrior such as Groote Pierre, because they'd obviously be fake swords. Only the tips were said to be blunted on some of them. This anonymous two-handed sword from the Rijksmuseum It's actually stated by the museum itself that this sword could have been used in combat. It's 207 centimeters long, or about 6'8". And while there obviously is evidence to support that some of these swords may have just been ceremonial swords, or at least repurposed to be ceremonial swords, that doesn't mean it's true for all of them. It's entirely reasonable that these swords would have been tried in battle, and possibly found to not be that effective. I have a hard time believing nobody would try it. Personally, from my experience, I feel like the 5 to 6 foot montante doesn't actually have that much of a huge advantage over other weapons of a respectable size. When fighting against a group, I would much rather have a longer sword. We do also have some examples of extremely large swords being used in battle in artwork. The sword featured in this picture is massive. It's even bigger than the halberd used by the opposing soldier. If you look at this guy in the back, he's actually got a pretty large sword mounted on his shoulder. However, if you take a really close look at it, you can see that that sword would go way over this guy's head. The average human head is 8 to 9 inches long, and that's about an extra head above his head. So if he's anywhere close to 6 feet tall, that's about a 7 foot long sword. There's a large tapestry depicting the Battle of Pavia. It was made sometime around 1530, which was pretty much the height of greatswords being used on the battlefield. This tapestry is massive, and it depicts a lot of stuff going on. Despite the magnitude of soldiers and weapons in this art, and the amount of battle going on, there's only a couple depictions of large greatswords. This guy here, though, resting on his greatsword, which is presumably planted in the ground, his feet and the sword are a little obscured by this flag. You can see this sword is way over his head, although he is leaning. So I did my best to straighten out all his features and stand him straight up. It looks a little weird, but even with doing that, that sword is still way over his head. And if he's anywhere near 6 feet tall, that is definitely a 7 foot sword at least. We might even possibly have a fencing manual. In the 1600s, a fencing master named Francisco Fernando Alfieri, described as an unparalleled master of fencing by several Italian fencing masters, wrote a fencing treatise known as The Art of Handling the Sword Well, which featured a section specifically on the lo spadone, or the greatsword. What's significant about his treatise is that the swords depicted in his book are absolutely massive. And while this could just be a case of bad art, given the sheer amount of detail in a lot of Alfieri's work, it's a little hard for me to believe. This 5 foot spadone trainer looks pretty wimpy compared to all these 7 foot monsters. Comparing the images from Alfieri's book to myself, based on the proportions of their hands and their face, I think it's pretty interesting that these swords come out to about the same size as the so-called bearing swords. Forge and Fire actually did an entire episode based on these kind of weapons, where they challenged competitors to recreate Groutepierre's 7 foot sword. And as you can see, they're not nearly as unwieldy as people make them out to be. These were made by swordsmiths, and it goes to show you that balance is everything. These bearing swords typically weigh around 15 pounds, which is double the weight of the montante I used in a previous video, which itself is 2 to 4 times heavier than a typical longsword. This 6 foot barbell weighs exactly 15 pounds. And while it's not balanced like a sword at all, and it's not very ergonomic, I was absolutely able to wield it around at combat effective speeds. This is a buff's head kukri. It weighs between 9 and 10 pounds, but it actually feels like it weighs even more than the barbell. And that's because of the amount of torque that you have to handle because of the way it's designed. It has a fairly short and fat handle. It wasn't easy to keep a strong grip on it, and the point of balance is over a foot up the blade. After that, the blade drops slightly. And that point where the blade drops weighs as much as the rest of the weapon. Now granted, it's only designed to go straight down. It's meant for a ceremonial beheading of a buffalo. But even with all this going against you, you can still pull off some combat effective techniques, and balance is everything. This is my personal fencing sword. It's actually kind of a Frankenstein sword. It's made up of components of several different swords. The blade is made by Castile and it's very light.
Hey, excuse me. Excuse me. Hello?
But the pommel here, that was a custom build. You can't buy this anywhere. And it's actually fairly heavy. It weighs exactly 1 pound and 2 ounces. So while most swords have a point of balance that's just above the crossguard, my sword actually has a point of balance below the crossguard, making it incredibly fast and nimble, and it hits very lightly.
All right, Michael, balance point. Right where I freaking want it.
My point here is that there is at least some precedence that swords of an extremely large size could have plausibly been used in some capacity within the medieval or Renaissance era. So don't be so quick to just write them off as bearing swords. Personally, I think it's completely plausible that a large 7 or 8 foot sword could be used exactly the same way that halberds and other long chopping or slashing weapons could be used. But could these supermassive fantasy greatswords possibly have been used in that same capacity? Big giant swords are so popular now that there are actually blacksmiths who dedicate themselves to making them, and you can actually buy them. Blacksmiths like Michael Cthulhu and Pretty Hate Machining have made a living making these things, and they show you how they make them on their YouTube channels. There are also people who have dedicated themselves to using them and training with them. Soul Fitness Evolution on YouTube uses a 50-pound Dragon Slayer trainer that he uses specifically for exercise. So this is becoming kind of a thing. I'm seeing more and more people who are using these giant sword simulators as a form of training. And it's awesome to see that you can build yourself up to be able to handle this weight and swing them around effectively. I found several sites online that sell them, and they weigh about 20 pounds. Digitally Twisted Outlaw on YouTube does about the same thing, except for his is sharpened steel. It's a bit trimmed down from the actual Dragon Slayer, which would weigh a little bit over 300 pounds, I believe. But he does some cool tests with it, and he's trying to develop his own fighting style with it. Now his Dragon Slayer weighs about 48 pounds, and while he handles it pretty well, he admits that his fitness level is not quite where it needs to be to bring out the sword's full potential.
Oh my god!
Alan Pan had a 50-pound Buster sword that he needed a special exoskeleton suit to lift it up with. He brought some big strong dude on his channel who was able to wield the sword with absolutely frightening speed. After a certain weight, they get kind of unmanageable. This 120-pound Buster sword made by Pretty Hate Machining could barely be lifted by a guy who can rank within the top 10 of the world's strongest man contests. And this guy's like 6'8" and probably around 300 pounds. So we have real examples, and we can actually see what they can do. So I'm going to try to do my best to give you an idea of how fast most of these swords can move. I've done a large weapon speed test before. You can check it out on my channel with lots of historical weapons, antiques, and modern reproductions. I figure the majority of these swords can at least complete a 90-degree cut, or something close to that. So I did my best with like the limited footage that they have on a lot of these channels. A lot of the times they like to do slowdowns every time they go for a swing, so you can see in slow motion the damage they do. Alright, so let's look at the results. Now, first thing you might notice that a lot of these times are the same. That's because the timer that I used really sucks, and it's really hard to find a timer on YouTube that actually shows all the milliseconds. So just worry about that first number after the decimal. So this is essentially the time it took for each of these weapons to complete roughly a 90-degree swing, basically from overhead to about waist level. Obviously, it's a little funky. Some of these swings were done from a running start. Some of them were even assisted by another person. I'm just trying to give you an idea. So the first 4 on this list are functional weapons, as well as a modern tree felling axe that weighs over 5 pounds. And now in the big speed test that I've done, that axe was one of the slowest items that we tested. So keep that in mind. A little bit further down, you can see the 7.5 pound montante that I tested in a previous video also. And just a bit further down from that, you can see the buff set kukri, which weighs about 9.4 pounds. That was the absolute slowest weapon from that speed test that we did. Now, in between there, you might notice there's a lot of giant, extremely heavy swords. I couldn't get weights on all of them. It was very hard to collect as many as I did. But I just wanted to give you an idea that a lot of these weapons can at least achieve one good at a dangerous speed. Now, obviously, these weapons are really huge and much easier to see and much easier to track. For many of these swords, they obviously only have about one swing in them. So you'd really have to make a count if you were using one of these things. And secondly, is another big one, is that when they actually do hit something, a lot of the times, these big broad ones especially, will actually just flop onto their side. So I feel like these kinds of swords would be good for taking out maybe wooden shields, but I have no idea how they do against armor. I am 100% sure they can knock somebody out. Most of them can also complete a horizontal cut. The momentum of the swing takes you so far around that actually a spinning attack is actually a pretty viable option. With heavy weapons, you want to keep the momentum going. Rising cuts can be done, but you're really fighting gravity on that. So having a non-sharpened area so that you can rest the sword on your shoulder gives you more options to attack with. Basically allowing your shoulder to assist an attack where you can roll the sword off your shoulder. A curved and single-edged version of one of these weapons is probably, in my opinion, the best way to go. A lot of these fantasy ultra great swords don't have any ability to catch or manipulate an opponent's weapon. However, if you are using one of these and you are fighting as part of a group, then standing in a back line while others protect you and then looking for a key opportunity to drop your weapon might be the best way to go. And that's not too different from how cutting or slashing weapons were used in unit formations, such as glaives or halberds or weapons of that kind. The fact is, in those dense formations, you wouldn't be able to swing your weapon in many other ways anyway. So in that sense, it's perfectly reasonable they could be used. After the weapon hits the ground, it isn't actually necessary to pick the thing up and go for another strike. You could plant it in the ground and then hold it vertically and use it as a shield, especially for the more broad versions. You can draw a shorter weapon that can easily maneuver behind it, such as a Katzbalger, which accompanied larger swords, or you can use it like a Roman scutum, and a weapon like a gladius or a spada could easily be used. A 15th century manuscript by Fiore de Liberi gives us a technique involving the quarterstaff or a spear, where you plant it in the ground, and using footwork and rocking the weapon back and forth, you can actually protect yourself from incoming thrust or cuts, although it's pretty hard to keep up for a long period of time. A 16th century fencing treatise by Salvador Fabrice gives us a similar technique, but this with a much shorter sword. So I think it's very plausible with these large swords that you can actually use this technique. Then perhaps when you're cleared of any danger, you could withdraw and get the thing back on your shoulder and go for another strike. If there's other people doing the same exact technique as you, perhaps you can create something of a shield wall. Here I came up with two simple ideas of what I thought would be kind of a more functional giant sword that I could think of. There's so many of these freaking things out there, I have no idea if somebody's already done ones like this. I'm sure they have. The one on the left was based off of a falchion, just supposed to be bigger, but it actually kind of just looks like a clip point knife or something. The main feature on the weapon is a portion on the back of the blade where you can actually grip it and put your hand in so that you can manipulate the weapon differently. It gives you better options for using it. This one on the right has a big hole through the middle. Michael Cthulhu came up with this idea for one of his swords, and I thought it was pretty brilliant. You can use that hole in the middle to hold the swords in various different ways that you otherwise couldn't. There's two pointed bits at the tip of the blade, kind of like the Requiem from Soul Calibur. That's basically just meant to be like an armor-piercing function to give it something more than just chopping and slashing. It can potentially pierce armor or even catch into pieces of armor or catch shields, and you can pull and stuff like that. Both blades are meant to have fullers and grooves that are meant to mitigate the weight. I don't know if I drew it very well. They also feature minimal hand interference around the handle and a space for you to rest the sword on your shoulder. But those are just my ideas based on my knowledge and experience in historical European martial arts. Personally, I love big giant swords, and I like that fantasy worries about form over function. If they restricted their imagination by worrying too much about being practical, we wouldn't have so many cool things to talk about. I hope you choose to support me in the future. I would like to do this again with different weapons. So if you could like and subscribe, it literally means more than pretty much anything. I'll see you next time.